I turned 74 last winter on a morning when the snow in Boise looked like sifted flour and the birch by my porch creaked the way old bones do. And I remember thinking that if I kept moving slowly but constantly, like a man wading against the shallow current of a river he knows well, the day would treat me gently and the house would not feel so cavernous. For the past 3 years, I have lived alone in the same 3-bedroom I bought with Ethel in 1981, an honest house with a stubborn furnace and a basement that smells the way basements should, cardboard dust, detergent, and something metallic like a penny rubbed between your fingers. Though I will admit that when the heat cuts out at 2 in the morning and I tramp down the steps to coax the pilot light, I sometimes say her name out loud just to see if the air will change. It never does. It only settles back into the heavy hush that has hung here since she died. A hush I have tried to tame with routine. A kettle that squeals at 5:45, oatmeal on the back burner even in July, the crossword in pen until the ink smears the side of my hand, and a walk around the block with a cane I pretend is for show because a retired chemistry teacher who lectured rowdy juniors for 30 years cannot be humbled by a little ache in the knee. I am not an interesting man, or at least I never believed I was, which is probably why my students liked me. I taught stoichiometry by comparing it to making stew. I talked them through the smell of sulfur by remembering the burnt tips of backyard matches. I kept a jar of peppermint on my desk for the ones who came in with nerves like birds. And I learned that attention is the most valuable element in a classroom's periodic table. More reactive than sodium, more stabilizing than argon, and that if you gave it to a child long enough and without pretense, many of them would choose to be decent. Not because decency was glamorous, but because it felt like a door propped open in late May, when the room smelled faintly of wet paper. Ethel used to joke that I collected strays and then forgot to stop collecting, and she was right. I have a shoebox of letters with ballpoint hearts over the eyes, a handful of graduation announcements pressed flat under Bible commentaries I read out of habit, and a photograph of the lab from my last year where the kids wrote Mr. M forever in dry erase and pretended it would hold like stone. And all of this has kept me company in the quiet hours, alongside the sensible clink of dishes and the occasional sermon on the radio when the hosts are tired enough to sound kind. If I sound sentimental, it is because I am. And if I am sentimental, it is because I have lived long enough to know that sentiment, unlike nostalgia, is not a trick mirror, but the sober inventory of what you have lost and what you are trying not to misplace. And what I am forever on the verge of misplacing is patience, not with the world, which is chaotic in exactly the way chemistry prepares you for, but with the slow erosion of trust inside a family after the polite phrases are worn down to their subtext. My daughter, Lelzy, a name she dislikes because it always reads like a typo, lives 20 minutes away and is one of those brisk women whose phone never stays still on the table. She talks in numbers, commissions, balances, the fantasy of early retirement. And she has a way of leaning back when things get too warm. And in her presence, I sometimes shrink to the version of myself I was, when I was a young husband who over-explained everything. The man Ethel teased by calling Professor Gentle even when I lost my temper over an unbalanced checkbook or a stuck window. I do not blame Lelzy for her distance, not entirely, because she married too young and divorced with less money than she expected. And life taught her to wear a hard shell the way lab safety taught me to wear goggles, even when the experiment looked tame. We are not estranged. We meet for church on holidays, and she texts me weather alerts when the forecasts get hysterical. But the older I get, the more I sense that she has filed me under reliable but impractical. The sort of father who will show up with a casserole and the wrong advice. The sort of man who says, "Let me help," and accidentally breaks whatever was only barely holding together. And I can live with that classification if it keeps the peace. Because after Ethel's stroke, I learned that keeping the peace is an occupation in itself, and that silence, when chosen, can be a craft, not a surrender. The house made room for my grandson Justin last spring when the community college held his seat, but he could not make himself sit in it. And while I would prefer to say he arrived like an answered prayer, the truth is he arrived like a storm that pretended to be a breeze. He came with 2 duffels and a smile that used to belong to a boy who rode his bike into our hedge every 4th of July. And the first week he slept until noon, washed a single plate with the force of a man rescuing it from a shipwreck, and thanked me too often in a voice that knew gratitude could be currency. I told myself the same story I told about so many seniors who drifted after graduation. Give it time. He will find a job. He will take a night class. He will rediscover the part of himself that loved to fix things. He was a wizard with motel alarm clocks when he was 9, could open them and coax the red digits back from the dead. And I would stand beside him the way my grandfather once stood beside me in a garage that smelled of gasoline and pride, humming tunelessly until the wrench rang like a bell. I am not blind to the boy's shadows, though I trained myself to look with kindness before suspicion. Justin is broad-shouldered and handsome the way a young man is handsome without effort, and that kind of beauty can become a grievance when it isn't met with opportunity. So when he slouched into the kitchen after midnight with pupils like spilled ink and a restlessness I recognized from my own worst nights, I told myself it was grief for a childhood that had ended without ceremony, or anxiety gnawing at his sleep, or, most charitably, simple youth burning its excess fuel. He promised me, unprompted, that he would contribute a little rent once the job at the auto parts store came through. And I, who have always been easy prey for the future tense, nodded and said, "Of course," and we drew up a list of chores on the back of an envelope that also contained 2 coupons and the last grocery list Ethel ever wrote, her O looping the way it always did, and for a day and a half the sink stayed empty and the trash made its orderly pilgrimage down the driveway. I liked having him around. There is no point pretending otherwise. I liked the scrape of a second chair, the rumble on the stairs, the whistled snippets of a song he would never sing in front of me. And though I will not romanticize the smell of his laundry or the way he left his shoes in places designed to trip an old man, I will say that I slept better because the house felt less like a museum and more like a home that was still being invented. On Saturdays, I cooked too much, and on Sundays, I used the leftovers as proof that abundance could outwit worry. And when he spoke about the future, his voice lifted at the end like a bridge that hadn't decided yet whether to land or keep going, and I hung my memories like lights along that span and told myself that a steady hand and a generous heart can be enough to steer another person's ship past the rocks. As if I were not the same man who failed to persuade his own daughter that gentleness could be stronger than alarm. You will wonder, because everyone does in these stories, whether I noticed anything unusual about the basement, and I will say no. Not at first. Not beyond the hum that turned on when the dehumidifier remembered its purpose, or the occasional clink of glass that could have been any household thing. And while it is fashionable to call this denial, I call it trust. The sort of trust you extend to someone you love, because you would rather be wrong kindly than right suspiciously. Besides, the basement has always been my domain, and I gave it up the way a king might surrender a small province when he is tired of the paperwork. A gesture of generosity I took as symbolic, because when a man yields his workspace, he is saying, "I believe you will treat it with dignity." And dignity, to my mind, is the root of all good behavior. I told Justin the first week that if he wanted to use the old workbench for his bike parts, he should clear the area by the paint cans and keep the bleach on the highest shelf so he wouldn't mix what shouldn't be mixed, And he nodded earnestly and told me he liked the smell down there because it reminded him of the aquarium store we took him to when he was little. And I laughed, thinking how memory folds upon itself, how a scent can layer one life over another until you are not sure which year you are in, or which version of the boy is standing in front of you, asking for $5 and a ride. The neighbors approved, at least the ones who speak. Mrs. Hanks said I was brave to try again with the younger generation, and Mr. Patel patted my shoulder in a way that told me he did not expect it to go well, but that he respected the attempt. And in the evenings, when the light slanted across the cul-de-sac just right, Justin would shoot hoops with the high school kids and look, for half an hour, like someone who had stepped back into his proper timeline. And I stood at the mailbox pretending to read the flyers, because it felt indecent to stare directly at happiness when you are aware of its habit of dissolving at a touch. I suppose this is the portion of the story in which I confess my flaws, so the later chapters can make sense. So here is a confession with the weight of a family Bible. I have always believed that if I tended to a person the way you tend to a fire, watching, feeding, adjusting the draft, then that person would grow in the direction of light. And because I believed this, I ignored the moments when Justin's jokes slid into nastiness, when he took calls on the porch with a furtiveness that turned the lawn into enemy territory, when he insisted that the Wi-Fi router be moved to the far corner of the living room for signal issues that were not, as I later learned, about signal at all. I ignored these things because I was tired of being a lonely man who flinched at footsteps, and because the alternative was to become a sentinel in my own house. And I had promised myself after Ethel's last ambulance ride that I would stop living like a siren was always about to sound. At night, before I turned out the lamp, I would talk to Ethel in the way that devout widowers do, asking trivial favors like better tomatoes at the market and serious ones like a little courage for the boy. And I imagined that if she were still here, she would put her hand on my forearm in that way that felt like a small bird landing, and she would warn me to be careful without making me feel like a fool. And I would listen because she had a way of being right without needing to be. In her absence, I tried to train my conscience to sound like her, but the voice that came was my own, weary and hopeful, and a little vain, and it told me to wait, to believe just a week more, just a month more, to take a deep breath when the car doors slammed at 2 a.m., and to remember that men have survived far worse than a grandson with a need for second chances. If this reads like a plea for sympathy, it is not. It is the ledger of an ordinary life at the point where the columns still balance, the calm before an audit I could not imagine. And if I revisit these days with more tenderness than they deserve, it is because tenderness is the last luxury a man my age can afford without permission, and because on the morning everything began to tilt, when a certain call would rumble through the house like a storm rolling in from the hills. I was standing at the sink, breathing the steam off my mug, thinking of nothing in particular except the way Justin had, the night before, set his plate in the dishwasher without being asked, and how small mercies, when you are starving for reassurance, can taste like a feast. It was a Tuesday in early spring, the kind of day when the air smells faintly of thawed dirt, and you start to think winter might finally surrender, when I heard the knock at the door that sounded wrong from the very first strike. Too loud, too official, the sort of knock that does not wait for politeness to answer. I was in the kitchen rinsing a coffee cup, watching a single robin dart across the brittle grass, when the sound came again, 3 deliberate thuds, and before I could dry my hands, the doorbell joined in, impatient and metallic. I thought perhaps it was a salesman or one of those earnest kids collecting signatures about zoning laws. But when I opened the door, the world rearranged itself into something that would never again be ordinary. 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, boots muddy from the yard, their hands poised near their belts in the way men are trained to do when they expect things to go badly. Behind them, at the curb, a patrol car idled with its lights off, but its presence loud enough to make the neighbors' curtains twitch. "Mr. Manley?" the taller one asked, and when I nodded, the second stepped slightly forward and said, "We got a 911 call from this address. Are you all right, sir?" For a heartbeat, I couldn't even process the words. The question was backward, absurd. "Of course I'm all right," I said. "Why wouldn't I be?" And then, as if on cue, Justin appeared at the end of the hall, his hoodie half-zipped, his face pale, but arranged into the frightened innocence of someone performing sincerity for an unseen jury. "He's been yelling," Justin told them before I could open my mouth. "He grabbed a knife from the counter." I didn't know what he was going to do. The officer's eyes flicked toward my hands, still damp from the sink, and then to the counter, where the paring knife lay beside the cutting board, gleaming under the kitchen light like a prop that had wandered in from another play. I tried to speak, but the words came out in a tangle of disbelief. "That's ridiculous," I said. "I was slicing an apple. You can see the apple right there." And indeed, the half-eaten fruit sat on the plate, the skin curling where the air had kissed it. Yet the scene looked staged now, as though my innocence had been clumsily arranged after the fact. The officers exchanged a look that was both cautious and weary, a look I had seen 100 times in the faces of teachers breaking up fights, unsure who started it, certain only that someone must be lying. "Sir, would you mind stepping outside for a moment?" one said, and though the phrasing was polite, it carried the weight of command. I stepped out onto the porch, still wiping my hands on the dish towel, and felt the cool air press against my chest. From the corner of my eye, I saw Mrs. Hanks across the street, pretending to prune her rose bushes, her curiosity blooming faster than the buds. Inside, Justin's voice rose and fell in nervous explanation. He snapped, started talking about how people don't respect him anymore. I tried to calm him down, but he got this wild look. It was theater, and a cruel one, and I felt the first real tremor of something darker than anger. Betrayal's cold, familiar cousin. The older officer asked if there were any firearms in the house. "Only memories," I said, before catching myself, and the line, meant as deflection, sounded eccentric enough to confirm their doubts. They asked if they could take a look around. I told them they could. After 30 years in a public school system, you stop believing you have much left to hide. One stayed with me on the porch while the other walked through the rooms, radio murmuring at his shoulder. I heard the footsteps descend to the basement, a hollow echo I had always associated with chores and solitude. And for a moment, everything went very still, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the thudding in my chest. The officer beside me shifted his weight. "Your grandson seemed pretty shaken," he said in the tone of someone offering both warning and invitation. "He said you've been having some confusion lately." I almost laughed, the sound brittle and humorless. Confusion? I could give a lecture on the periodic table right now, every element in order, if that would convince you. But reason rarely competes well with youth's performance of fear. The officer nodded in that soft way meant to de-escalate, but I could feel the suspicion settle between us like fog. Then came a shout from below, sharp, startled, not quite alarmed but close, and the second officer's voice echoing up the stairs. "You might want to come down here." They led me down into the basement as though I were a guest at my own undoing. The air grew cooler, denser, tinged with something acrid I could not immediately name. The bulbs hummed above us, one flickering, and for a heartbeat I did not understand what I was looking at. The old workbench where I used to fix radios was no longer cluttered with paint cans and spare parts, but transformed into a strange laboratory of glassware and tubing. Beakers, flasks, burners, all too new, too clean. There were plastic bins filled with crystalline residue, chemical containers stripped of their labels, and a faint sweet odor that made the back of my throat tighten. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "can you explain what this is?" I stared at the apparatus, my mind scrambling through every possible benign explanation. Perhaps Justin had taken up some online science course. Perhaps he was making homemade soap, perhaps. But the evidence mocked me in its precision. "This isn't mine," I said, hearing the smallness of my own voice. I had no idea he was doing this. The younger officer, the one from upstairs, turned to me with an expression that hovered between pity and disbelief. "Your grandson called us because he said you were acting unstable. Now we find this. You can see how it looks." They photographed everything, their cameras flashing like small bursts of judgment. I stood there, half in shadow, while one of them read a list of chemicals aloud into his radio. Acetone, pseudoephedrine, lithium strips, words that had once belonged to the classroom now condemned me. The irony was obscene. I had spent my life teaching young people how to handle reagents responsibly, how to respect volatility, how to balance equations between danger and discipline, and here I was surrounded by the desecration of that creed. Justin hovered at the top of the stairs, pretending to tremble, his voice a strained whisper. "I told you he was doing something weird down there. I tried to stop him." "Justin," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "you know that's not true." But he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Please, Grandpa," he murmured, as if begging me to cooperate in the fiction. I took a step toward him, and immediately one of the officers raised his hand. "That's enough, sir. Step back." The command sliced the air cleanly, and I obeyed, though the humiliation burned hotter than any anger I had felt in years. They handcuffed me in my own basement. The metal was cold, the motion practiced, and I could hear the faint wheeze of my breath inside the mask of disbelief. The camera lights continued to flicker, capturing not just the evidence, but the quiet collapse of everything I thought I understood about loyalty. When they led me up the stairs, I saw the kitchen anew, apple still on the plate, knife glinting like an exclamation point at the end of a sentence I hadn't written. Outside, the neighbors had gathered in small, fascinated knots. Phones were raised. I could already imagine the captions. "Local grandfather arrested in drug raid." As they guided me toward the patrol car, Justin stood on the porch, his arms folded, his expression carefully blank, a mask rehearsed too many times. For a second I saw in him the little boy who once brought me a frog cupped gently in his palms, asking if chemistry could tell him why its skin was so slick. That child flickered behind the man before me, then vanished. "You're making a mistake," I told the officers, but the word sounded archaic, a phrase from another century when innocence was assumed until disproven. At the station, under the hard fluorescence that makes every face look guilty, they asked again and again about the setup in the basement. I told them I knew nothing, that my grandson had been living with me for months, that I had trusted him. "He's a good boy," I said out of habit, even as the memory of his expression at the door began to curdle inside me. They took my fingerprints, my photograph, my dignity. I signed forms without reading them, because what else was there to do? And through it all I kept seeing the same image, the faint trail of dust on the basement floor where his sneakers must have trodden back and forth carrying equipment. The quiet industry of betrayal happening right under my roof while I slept upstairs, believing I was helping. Near midnight, they let me sit alone in a room with a plastic chair and no clock. Through the narrow window, I could see the blurred outline of city lights. I thought of calling Lelsey, but could not bear the sound of her voice saying, "What have you done now, Dad?" So I waited. Eventually an officer returned, softer now, saying they were still verifying the details. "Your grandson's gone," he added. "We can't locate him. Phone's off." He hesitated, almost human. "If what you're saying is true, sir, it'll come out." When they finally released me on account of my age and the lack of clear evidence, dawn was breaking in a thin, gray smear across the sky. I stepped out into it, with my clothes smelling of disinfectant and the faint ghost of ammonia. The street outside the station was empty, except for the hum of vending machines. I walked the half-mile home, because I could not stand the thought of sitting beside a stranger who might recognize me. Each block lengthened like a corridor in a dream, and with every step I rehearsed conversations that would never happen. Explanations, apologies, appeals to reason. None of them sounded convincing. When I reached my house, the front door was still ajar from where the officers had left it. Inside, the air was heavy with the residue of intrusion. Papers scattered on the table, drawers half open, the faint outline of gloved hands on the banister. In the living room, the answering machine. Light blinked, insistent. I pressed play, and Justin's voice filled the room. "Sorry, Grandpa, I didn't have a choice. You'll understand someday." Then the click, final as a slammed door. I sat down at the kitchen table, looking at the knife, the apple now brown and shriveled, and I felt the world tilt slightly, as if gravity had been rewritten just for me. Everything I thought I was, teacher, father, decent man, seemed to hover above that single phrase. I didn't have a choice. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere distant, and for the first time in my life, I could not tell whether it was coming to save me or to confirm that I no longer needed saving. In the hours after I found the door ajar and the apple gone brown on the plate, I told myself that the worst had already happened, that the law had taken its hard look and would now step back to let reason do its slower work. Yet by late afternoon, it was clear that the first knock had merely loosened a seam, and now everything was beginning to pull apart at once, threads catching on every rough surface in town. The squad car returned with a different pair of officers, and this time there was a clipboard, a warrant crisp as a new dollar, and the careful choreography of men who expected to find what they were looking for. And I stood on the lawn while they moved past me like weather, all purpose and inevitability. The cuffs clicking on my wrists again, not because I was dangerous, though that word had become a shadow attached to me, but because policy prefers its boxes ticked. And across the street, Mrs. Hanks filmed with her phone held high enough to steady her moral back, and two teenagers on scooters pretended to be uninterested while narrating softly for a feed I could not see. Before the officers descended to the basement, they photographed the porch, the door frame, the living room where my high school retirement plaque had hung for years. And though I told them the plaque had nothing to do with anything, they were kind enough not to say that innocence and a wall of commendations rarely correlate. And when they reached the bottom of the stairs, I heard the same short intake of breath as the day before, followed by the formal language of inventory that makes a home sound like a crime scene and a life like a list. Glassware, chemical containers, plastic bins, heat sources, unknown powder, and with every noun I felt a small subtraction inside me, as if I were being dismantled into parts and the screws were rolling down into the floor cracks where no one ever retrieves them. Within an hour the cul-de-sac was a low-grade spectacle. A second car idled behind the first. An unmarked sedan came and went, and someone, later I learned it was a local stringer who sells disasters by the pound, asked if they could get a clean shot of the suspect by the steps. And because the officers declined, not out of mercy, but out of procedure, the stringer made do with my reflection trembling in the living room window. and by nightfall I had become a headline softened by a question mark. Breaking Bad Grandpa? Because even our meanness wants to be entertained. And I watched the view count tick up on a borrowed phone in a waiting room that smelled of lemon disinfectant, while a detective read me a set of cautions I could have recited from memory after a lifetime of assemblies. When they let me go again, not because they believed me, but because evidence must be sorted before it can be shaped into charge, I walked home through a dusk that made the familiar look theatrical. And as I cut across the church parking lot, I saw Pastor Jim pin a notice to the bulletin board and lower his eyes when he realized I had seen him. And later I would learn that the churchmen's group felt it best if I took a season away until clarity emerged, as if clarity is a weather system that visits at the convenience of committees. The next morning brought the first phone call from the school district. In light of recent events, they were temporarily removing my name from the Hall of Service, followed by an email from an insurance company I did not recognize, informing me that my home policy would be reviewed and that any illegal activity, proven or suspected, could affect coverage, and then a letter from the bank advising me that several recent transactions had been flagged. Apparently, the purchase of specialized lab glassware and solvents had been routed through my debit card. Small charges that would have seemed like hobbyist curiosities if there had not been a basement full of corroboration. And I stood there with the paper in my hands, realizing that while I was sleeping upstairs or pressing shirts for church, someone was using my good name as a mask, and it fit him well enough that no one bothered to check the seams. I phoned the number on the letter and attempted the old magic, measured politeness, clarity, the teacherly cadence that once steadied whole rooms. But the representative apologized in a polished loop and explained that until the police closed their file, there was nothing she could unflag. And I hung up to find a text from my daughter that started with Dad and ended with a question I could not answer. Because what do you say to your own child when she asks whether she needs to hire a lawyer to protect her son from you? I called her, and the conversation unraveled the way conversations do when both participants are balancing fear, pride, and the dead weight of history. And when she said, "I always worried something like this could happen," I felt the floor list gently beneath me because the sentence was too practiced, as if she had been saving it for the day my decency failed its exam. And to defend myself, I had only the flimsy shield of the ordinary. My lists, my routines, the small ethics that do not perform well under cross-examination. By afternoon, a city code officer in a pale vest knocked and handed me a notice citing hazardous materials and abatement requirements. And the language suggested fines that would outlive me, and I signed in the designated spaces because signing my name was the only act that still resembled control. Afterward, I went down to the basement with a box of contractor bags and the old yellow gloves Ethel used for spring cleaning, intending to tidy what could be tidied, but the air pinched at the back of my throat, and the metallic tang that had seemed harmless the previous week now felt predatory. And I realized that I did not even know which objects it was legal to touch, which substances might be sleeping lightly in the cool air, which pieces of my own house had been transformed into evidence. And while I stood there in the shifting light, my forearm began to itch where the glove gapped, a harmless red flare that calmed when I washed it, but returned as a warning every time I tried to descend the stairs. So in the end, I folded, as old men must sometimes fold, and I put a sign at the top step that said, "Do not enter," as if signs were spells, and caution tape could persuade sorrow to take the long way around. The neighbor's kindness fractured along predictable seams. Mr. Patel crossed the street to tell me his niece once dated a boy who fooled everyone and that he was praying for me. And then, as if remembering an errand, he asked whether the police would be back again, because his wife gets migraines. 2 houses down, a woman I barely knew left a pie with a note that said, "We all make mistakes." God heals. And when I thanked her, she looked disappointed that I had not confessed anything. A boy on a BMX bike asked if he could see the lab, and I told him he could see the inside of a book, and he laughed the laugh that tells a man he has already lost jurisdiction. That night I did not sleep, and in the pale hours that pretend to be morning, I sat at the kitchen table trying to map a path back to ordinary. And the best I could come up with was a sequence of calls that felt like knocking on locked doors. A criminal defense attorney whose voice carried the dry patience of someone who has watched the innocent learn how a little innocence buys. A former colleague who knew a reporter at the paper who might be convinced to add the word alleged. And a retired cop from my church who once coached our safety drills and who said, with a gentleness that made me want to weep, that if Justin was the source of the operation, the truth would surface because kids leave trails wider than they think. And then he asked a question that pulled a thread I had been avoiding. Had there been packages, deliveries at odd hours, changes to the Wi-Fi password, unexplained cash, the smell of solvents masquerading as cleaning products? And with each item, my memory offered a yes it had previously misfiled as maybe. And by the end of the call, I understood that the first escalation of a crisis does not announce itself with sirens, but with the slow correction of hindsight, the way a lens finds focus after you have already taken the picture. I went looking for small proofs that I was not the fool the world had drafted me to be, wandered the rooms in a daze, taking inventory of the ordinary. The checked dish towels Ethel bought on sale, the chip mug with the high school mascot, the oil stain in the garage shaped suspiciously like Idaho. In the trash, I found a padded envelope addressed to me with a return label from a shell company that the attorney would later say appears every time a boy thinks he has finally beaten adulthood at its own game. And inside the envelope was nothing, emptiness as evidence. And in the laundry, I found a hoodie that reeked of a sweetness too chemical to be candy. And when I pressed it to my face, a memory rose of Justin hugging me absent-mindedly in the hallway, quick and perfunctory, and how I had inhaled the scent and labeled it new detergent, the way a man will rename anything to avoid the obvious. The school district sent a second notice, this one with more careful language about community standards, and a student I had once helped pass the state exam messaged me to say he believed me, and then asked if I could call his mother to confirm it, which is how reputations die, asking for witnesses while the crowd votes with their scrolling. That evening, as if to test the tensile strength of my remaining stubbornness, a patrol cruised past slowly, and though I knew they had the right to do it, the sight of the car moving at the speed of doubt made my throat tighten. A young officer in the passenger seat glanced at me and then looked away, and I wondered if he had ever sat in my class, if some small kindness of mine now made his shoulders tense with the embarrassment mercy produces in the young. Before bed, I dialed my daughter again and left a message that tried to be both father and defendant, and I told her I would talk to anyone she hired, answer anything, submit to any test. And as I set the phone down, I saw that Justin's last text to me, "Back late, don't wait up," still sat pinned at the top of our thread like a note on a fridge for a man too trusting to understand that the fridge had been emptied while he slept. In the dark, the house made its familiar noises, the heater cycling, the birch rubbing the siding, but a new sound threaded through the old, the thrum of attention gathering itself beyond my walls. Not a mob exactly, not yet, but something like weather tightening, and I lay awake realizing that what escalates first in a scandal is not the danger, but the interpretation, and that if I did not find the courage to hold on to my own version of events, the town would lend me one already paid for by someone else's fear. It was almost 3 weeks after the first knock when the true pivot arrived, that slow-motion turn of the world in which everything I believed about my own life finally surrendered to the version that other people had already agreed upon. And yet, like most disasters, it began without drama. An envelope in the mailbox, the cheap municipal kind with a window and a logo that promises only bureaucracy. I carried it inside, slit it open with the same knife that had once sliced the fateful apple, and found a formal notice informing me that the county intended to seize a portion of my property pending further investigation into controlled substances produced or stored on premises. The language was clinical, the tone almost apologetic, as if the letter itself pitied me. I sat at the table reading it again and again until the words became a blur of symbols, and somewhere behind them I could almost hear Justin's voice saying, "Sorry, Grandpa," like a ghost, with perfect timing. That afternoon, while I was still absorbing the blow, the local news van appeared at the curb, its antenna rising like a periscope, and a young reporter with teeth too white for sincerity called out, "Mr. Manley, do you have any comment about the charges?" I told her there were no charges, not yet, but she smiled the way people smile when they know the headline will not wait for the truth. And I understood that the court of public opinion had already convened without me. I thought about calling my daughter again, but the memory of her last message stopped me. It had come the previous evening, terse and exhausted. "Dad, please stop drawing attention to this. We're trying to move on." Trying to move on. As if guilt were a stain you could scrub from the family's shared fabric while leaving the old man holding the dirty rag. I left the house instead, walking without direction through the neighborhood that had once been my sanctuary of routine, and noticed how every face now carried that strained expression of kindness that masks suspicion. At the corner store, the clerk who used to joke about my crossword habit rang up my milk without speaking, his eyes fixed somewhere near the cash drawer. In the reflection of the cooler doors, I saw myself as they must see me, unshaven, stooped, carrying the aura of something contagious. That night, unable to sleep, I made the mistake of turning on the television. There I was, frozen on the screen, a still image of me in handcuffs, surrounded by police, the caption reading, "Retired teacher, tied to meth operation under grandson's care." The words "under" and "care" twisted something in my chest. The segment was brief, but it featured an interview with an unnamed source close to the family, and when the muffled voice said, "He'd been having memory problems for years, maybe he got mixed up," I recognized the cadence, my daughter's way of cushioning blame with professional vocabulary. I turned off the set and sat in the silence that followed, heavy and absolute, until the phone rang again. Not the landline, but the cell I rarely used. It was the detective from before, the one with the prematurely gray hair and the careful diction of a man who has learned not to promise too much. "Mr. Manley," he said, "we've reviewed the lab analysis. The fingerprints on the glassware aren't yours." For a moment I couldn't speak. The words, so simple, so damning in their absence, should have freed me. Yet I sensed from his tone that this was not deliverance, but a new layer of ambiguity. "Then it's over," I said, but he hesitated. "Not exactly. The prints belong to your grandson, but he's still missing. We need to talk about how those materials ended up in your basement and how long he'd been living there." He paused, as if giving me the chance to confess to some smaller sin before the larger one was confirmed. I told him everything, the nights, the noises, the misplaced trust. When I finished, he sighed. "I believe you, Mr. Manley, but belief doesn't change paperwork. You're still listed as the homeowner, and until we locate him, the property stays impounded." When the call ended, I sat at the table with my hands folded like a student waiting for a reprimand. The house felt cavernous, the refrigerators hummed too loud, every clock ticking out its own accusation. I realized then that innocence, once doubted, never returns as it was. It limps, missing the confident stride it used to have. I made tea I didn't want, and watched steam rise from the mug, like the last visible trace of control. Around midnight, headlights swept across the living room wall, and I thought the police had returned again. But it was only a car slowing to stare, someone gathering proof that the pariah still lived among them. 2 days later, the detective called again. They had found a storage unit rented under my name, paid for with my bank card. Inside were boxes of precursor chemicals, more lab equipment, and several sealed bags containing substances that would keep a prosecutor employed for months. "It's your signature on the lease," he said, "but we think your grandson forged it. He had access to your checkbook, correct?" I confirmed that he did, that he'd help me pay bills online because the interfaces confused me. "That helps," the detective said, his voice tired. "We'll get him, Mr. Manley. These kids always slip up." The phrase, "these kids," lodged like a splinter. Justin was not some abstract delinquent. He was my blood, the boy who used to line up dominoes across the living room and call it chemistry. I thanked the detective and hung up, but the relief was poisoned with grief. The more they uncovered his guilt, the more I felt my own failure crystallize into something solid and cold. That night I dreamed of the basement. Only it wasn't the basement, it was my old classroom, the lab tables gleaming, the students moving like shadows. In the dream, Justin sat in the front row, staring at me with those dark, restless eyes. And when I tried to speak, nothing came out but the low hiss of a burner. I woke drenched in sweat, the taste of chemicals in my mouth, and realized that my body had absorbed the story, even if my mind refused to accept it. At dawn, I went outside, breathing in the cold air, and saw a police cruiser parked half a block away, engine idling. It didn't move when I waved. I went back inside and started cleaning the house with an almost manic precision, scrubbing surfaces, vacuuming corners, as if purity could be restored through friction. Each object carried a double meaning now. The coffee pot as evidence, the floor mat as potential hiding place, the family photos as witnesses, too silent to defend me. Late in the afternoon, the doorbell rang again. This time it was not the police, but a man in a suit, my attorney, Mr. Jennings, whom I could barely afford. He carried a folder thick with documents and the air of someone who has learned to measure hope in teaspoons. We sat at the table where all my disasters now began. "You're technically clear," he said, "but public opinion won't wait for a technicality. The police confirmed the lab belonged to your grandson. However, since the property was yours, you'll be liable for the cleanup costs and potentially for negligence if the prosecution argues you should have known." I stared at him. "Should have known," I repeated, as if love were an act of surveillance. He didn't answer. Instead, he slid across the folder with photos from the investigation, images of my basement transformed into an exhibit. Labels, gloves, beakers, the workbench glowing under artificial light. "They'll leak these eventually," he said. "Might as well see what the world will see." I looked at the photographs until the room blurred, until the paper might as well have been mirrors reflecting every oversight of my life. "Where is he?" I asked finally. Jennings sighed. "They think he's left the state, maybe with contacts in Oregon. He was dealing more than they first believed." The sentence was gentle, almost paternal, but it hollowed me out. I nodded, thanked him, and watched him leave. When the door closed, the silence returned with new authority. I sat in the chair Ethel used to favor during her crossword evenings and imagined her voice, calm, practical, the antidote to hysteria. She would have said, "Don't let them take your dignity, Walter. That's the only inheritance left to protect." The next day the first real sign of vindication arrived, though by then vindication had lost its sweetness. The police held a press conference announcing that the case had shifted focus to the missing suspect, Justin Manley. They used his name. My own was demoted to the homeowner. It should have felt like exoneration, but instead it felt like exile. My role in the narrative rewritten from villain to irrelevant footnote. Still, the neighbors' eyes began to change. Not forgiving exactly, but curious in a less hostile way, as if wondering whether they had misjudged. Some even muttered greetings again, tentative as new buds. Yet at the grocery store, 2 teenagers whispered near the cereal aisle, and one of them said, "That's the guy, the Grandpa Meth King." I didn't correct them. I simply pushed my cart away, pretending to compare prices. You learn quickly that protest only feeds the appetite of gossip. That evening I found myself staring at Justin's old room, the door half open, a faint trace of his cologne still in the air. I stepped inside and began sorting through the remnants of his stay. Clothes tossed in the closet, half-empty notebooks, a photo of him as a boy holding the frog he once showed me. Tucked between 2 textbooks was a small envelope, unsealed. Inside was a scrap of paper with a number written on it and the words, "In case something happens." I called the detective again, gave him the number, and within hours he confirmed it belonged to a prepaid phone purchased in Oregon. "We'll find him," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. After I hung up, I sat on the bed and finally allowed the anger to come. The deep, shaking kind that doesn't shout but rather vibrates through your ribs, like the aftershock of an explosion. That was the midpoint, the exact hinge of the story, the moment when my role changed from accused to survivor, when justice and loss became the same word pronounced with different inflections. It was the night I stopped waiting for the world to fix itself and began to understand that truth, no matter how clean, leaves a residue you can't scrub away. I poured myself a glass of water, stared at my reflection in it, and whispered into the quiet, "He was my grandson." The house, always listening, made no reply. By the time May unfolded, the lilacs outside had begun to bloom in defiance of everything that had gone wrong inside my house, and I remember thinking, with a kind of bitter amusement, that nature never pauses to see whether human lives have caught up with the season. The scent floated through the cracked kitchen window like a rumor of a world that still made sense, and for a few mornings I tried to convince myself that the worst was behind me, that Justin would eventually surface, the law would complete its tidy paperwork, and I could return to some reduced version of my former anonymity. But the truth is that the midpoint of a crisis is not its calm. It is merely the eye of the storm, the temporary hush before the next rotation tears loose what was still clinging to the ground. And the rotation began again when the first reporter from a national outlet arrived uninvited, her car gleaming like the future of my humiliation. She wanted a human interest angle, the story of a grandfather betrayed by blood, and when I refused to speak, she smiled sympathetically and said, "People will want to understand what kind of household produces both a teacher and a criminal." I closed the door gently, because anger at my age is expensive, but her words followed me through the rooms like a low-grade infection, and by nightfall her story appeared online under the headline, "The Chemistry of Family," when legacy turns toxic. The article quoted anonymous neighbors who described me as eccentric but pleasant, a phrase that sounded like an epitaph for a harmless lunatic, and it hinted that perhaps I had been unwittingly complicit in my grandson's operation, that my background in chemistry had made the deception easier. I realized then that innocence, once stretched, never returns to its original shape. Lelsey called the next morning, her voice tight with exhaustion, and said she wished I'd spoken to the reporter, because silence always sounds like guilt. I told her that silence is sometimes the only defense left to the honest, but she had already moved on to the logistics of her son's legal future, wondering aloud whether turning him in herself would help her image at work. The phrase, her image, lodged in my throat like a bone. He's not a product recall, Les, I said. He's a person. He's my grandson. There was a pause, the kind of pause that marks the distance between generations, and then she said softly, "He's my son, Dad. Don't forget that," and hung up. The next week brought new developments. The police traced Justin's movements through Oregon and into Northern California, following a pattern of small purchases and short-term rentals. Every update arrived in the voice of Detective Myers, whose professionalism had begun to soften into pity. "We think he's still manufacturing," he said once, almost apologetically. "He's clever but sloppy. He'll get caught." I didn't want him to get caught. I wanted him to stop. There's a difference between justice and prevention, and I still believed, foolishly, that I might somehow reach the boy beneath the ruin if only given the chance. That belief began to unravel the night I received a call from an unknown number. The connection was bad, full of static, but I recognized the breathing before the voice. "Grandpa!" It was him. I nearly dropped the phone. "Justin," I said too loudly. "Where are you? They're looking for you. You have to turn yourself in." There was a pause, then a quiet laugh that chilled me. "They won't catch me. You shouldn't have talked to them." "I didn't talk," I said. "I told the truth." He sighed, the sound young and ancient at once. "You always think the truth fixes things. It doesn't. It just makes people choose sides." Then the line went dead. After that night I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window until dawn, watching the street for shapes that never appeared. Every time headlights flashed, I hoped it was him returning, ready to repent, ready to tell me it had all been a misunderstanding. Instead, the police arrived again, not to accuse, but to inform. They'd raided a warehouse in Redding linked to Justin's operation. Inside, they found evidence connecting him to a wider network, including transactions made in my name. "We'll clear you entirely," Myers said, "but this thing is bigger than we thought." I asked if anyone had been hurt, and his silence told me everything. 2 young men arrested at the scene had overdosed during the bust. "They'll live," he added quickly, but the damage was done. For days I couldn't shake the image of those boys, somebody's sons, somebody's students, lying on a concrete floor because of a chain of events that began, indirectly, in my basement. The community's patience, thin as paper, finally tore. Someone spray-painted "Poison House." Across my fence one night, the letters crude but legible enough for the morning joggers to photograph. A few days later, a brick came through the front window with a note tied to it. "Teachers like you ruin kids." I swept the glass into a dustpan, each shard catching the light like a tiny verdict, and I told myself not to cry because the humiliation had already claimed enough moisture from me. The insurance adjuster refused coverage, citing criminal association. The cleanup crew quoted a price that made me laugh aloud. Half my pension for a basement I no longer dared enter. I began selling what I could. The china Ethel loved, the oak desk I'd once written lesson plans on, my old telescope that had spent more time staring at dust than stars. Each sale felt like amputating another memory. One evening, as I was boxing up books for donation, I found Ethel's old journal wedged behind a shelf. Her handwriting, neat and rounded, filled the pages with domestic nothings, recipes, weather notes, lists of people to call. But between them I found a sentence that pierced me. Walter believes people can be improved with care, but care is a form of blindness, too. I sat with that line for a long time, realizing she had seen something in me I had never named. My love for Justin had been a form of blindness, a faith so stubborn it ignored the evidence of decay. That night I dreamed again of my classroom, but this time the tables were overturned, and Justin stood by the door, holding a flask that glowed faintly blue. "You taught me everything," he said, and when I reached for him, he threw the flask, and the room filled with smoke. The next morning the detective called with news. They'd found him, not dead, not captured, but cornered and on the run after a shootout in a small town near the Nevada border. "He got away," Myers said, "but he's hurt. We'll get him soon." I thanked him mechanically, hung up, and walked to the window. Outside, the street looked unchanged, children on bicycles, sprinklers ticking, but the world I saw through the glass was permanently tilted. That evening, as the sun sank, a different kind of visitor came. A journalist who introduced herself as writing a book about the hidden epidemic of elder scapegoating. She spoke with empathy so polished it gleamed. "You're a symbol now," she said. "People see in you the failure of the American family." I told her I wanted no part of symbols. "Symbols," I said, "don't have to clean their own kitchens." She smiled sadly, wrote something in her notebook, and left behind a business card with a gold-embossed name I've already forgotten. Later that week, I received another call, this one from a lawyer representing one of the boys injured in the Reading raid. They were considering suing for damages, claiming negligence on my part. "It won't hold up," Jennings assured me, "but they'll try. People want someone to pay." I laughed again, that dry sound that no longer belonged to humor. "They already have someone," I said. "They just don't know he's my grandson." The pressure mounted like a fever. Letters arrived from strangers, some kind, some venomous, all intrusive. One woman wrote that she forgave me because Satan targets the righteous. Another said I should have been sterilized before raising a family. I started keeping the worst ones in a drawer, not out of masochism, but to remind myself that the world's cruelty was still at least creative. When the mail grew too heavy, I stopped opening it. Instead, I walked the neighborhood late at night, when no one could pretend not to stare. The birch tree by my porch shed its bark in long, pale strips, and each morning I found new curls of it on the lawn, as if the tree were discarding its skin in sympathy. In June, the second escalation reached its full height. The police finally caught Justin in a motel outside Reno. He was alone, unarmed, barely conscious from blood loss. I learned the details from the news before the detective could call. The footage showed him being loaded into an ambulance, his face pale, his hair matted with sweat. They said he'd tried to cross into Utah under a false name, that he'd been living off the sale of stolen prescription meds, that he'd left behind a ledger implicating several others. The reporters spoke of him as a criminal mastermind, but all I saw was the boy who once asked me why rainbows curve. When Myers finally phoned, his voice was solemn. "He's in custody," he said. "You can see him after the arraignment if you want." I agreed, though part of me dreaded the reunion more than the months of suspicion. The jail was a sterile maze of concrete and hum. When they brought him into the visiting room, I almost didn't recognize him. His skin had a gray cast, his eyes hollow but alert. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then he smiled, a strange, fragile smile that carried no warmth. "You look tired, Grandpa." I told him he looked like someone who'd been running from ghosts. "Maybe," he said. "But you made them, didn't you? You made me believe I could do anything." I tried to explain that belief and permission are not the same, that love is not a blank check, but he only shook his head. "You taught me formulas," he said. "I just found a way to profit from them." The guard signaled our time was nearly up. I leaned closer. "You could have come to me," I said. "I would have helped." He laughed softly, a sound of pure defeat. "You already did, Grandpa. You just didn't know it." After the visit, I sat in the parking lot for nearly an hour, unable to start the car. I realized that what I felt wasn't anger or pity, but a kind of terminal exhaustion. The recognition that redemption, like youth, is a luxury of those who haven't yet run out of chances. When I finally drove home, the sky was bruised with thunderclouds, and the first drops hit the windshield like punctuation marks in a sentence that would not end. That night I received one more call, from the detective again. "He confessed," Meyer said quietly, "to everything. Said he set you up so the operation could keep going if he got caught. He thought no one would suspect an old man. He wanted to protect himself. Protect himself." The phrase echoed until it lost meaning. I thanked the detective, ended the call, and sat alone in the half-dark kitchen. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the ruined fence with its faint graffiti scars. For the first time since Ethel's death, I prayed, not for justice, not even for forgiveness, but for stillness, for the spinning to stop. In the days that followed, the world began its slow, indifferent process of correction. The police cleared me formally. The news outlets moved on to newer scandals. The neighbors stopped watching, though their greetings remained careful, as if words could leave fingerprints too. Yet the real escalation, the one that mattered, was internal. The quiet realization that innocence is not a shield, but a wound that never quite scabs over. I had survived the storm, but survival felt less like triumph and more like residue. When summer deepened, I found myself back in the garden, trimming the lilacs. The scent was heavy, intoxicating, almost oppressive. I looked at the empty house next door, where the Hanks had moved away, unable to tolerate the bad energy. The street was silent, except for the drone of insects. I thought about Justin in his cell, about the years ahead of him, about the weight of a family name now whispered with pity. And I thought about my own part in the tragedy, not as the architect, but as the blind custodian of it, the man who mistook decay for adolescence. As twilight fell, I went down to the basement one last time. The police had stripped it clean, every trace of the lab gone, yet the smell lingered, a ghost of chemicals fused with the older scent of soap and dust. I stood in the center of the room, listening to the faint hum of the pipes, and realized that this, finally, was the second escalation's true meaning. Not the noise of accusation or the spectacle of guilt, but the unbearable quiet left when all the evidence has been removed and only the memory remains. I turned off the light, climbed the stairs slowly, and closed the door behind me, sealing it like a tomb. The day of Justin's sentencing arrived with the kind of heat that makes everything shimmer and blur, as if even the air wanted to forget. I had promised myself I wouldn't go, that I would let the legal machinery grind without my presence. But when the morning came, I found myself dressing carefully, polishing my old shoes, tying the same gray tie I'd worn to Ethel's funeral. Habit is a powerful substitute for courage. The courthouse stood like a tired monument, its steps crowded with reporters who had long since lost interest in the details and now hungered only for the photograph, the guilty youth and the broken old man in the same frame. Inside, the air smelled of paper and disinfectant. I sat in the second row behind the defense table, my cane leaning against my knee, my hands folded so tightly the knuckles blanched white. When they brought him in, He looked smaller than I remembered, his orange jumpsuit swallowing him, his wrists cuffed loosely, as though even the shackles had lost faith in his strength. For a moment he glanced back, and our eyes met across the sterile divide of the courtroom. There was no recognition, not exactly. More a tired acknowledgment, the nod two strangers give each other when they realize they have shared the same weather for too long. The prosecutor read through the charges in a flat, practiced rhythm. Possession, manufacturing, distribution, evasion, obstruction. Each word landed like a hammer on a nail that had already been driven deep. The defense lawyer, a man Justin's mother had hired with borrowed money and misplaced hope, spoke softly about youth, addiction, and influence. He gestured toward me once, saying, "My client was raised by a man of science, a man who valued experimentation." The implication hung in the air like smoke, and I saw a few heads turn toward me. I didn't flinch. I'd grown used to being the convenient variable in everyone else's equation. Then the judge asked if the defendant wished to make a statement before sentencing. Justin stood, cleared his throat, and began to speak in a voice I barely recognized. Hoarse, deliberate, the voice of someone translating from a language of pain. He said he was sorry, though the words felt rehearsed. He said he hadn't meant to hurt anyone. Then, unexpectedly, his gaze found me again. "My grandfather," he said, and the room stilled. "Taught me everything I know about chemicals. He also taught me that every reaction has an opposite. I guess this was mine." A murmur swept through the spectators, half pity, half condemnation. The judge silenced it with a gavel's tap. I could feel my pulse in my temples. For a fleeting moment, I wanted to stand up and shout that I had taught him chemistry, not cruelty, that knowledge is neutral until the hands using it decide otherwise. But I stayed seated. Silence, I realized, had been both my curse and my shield all along. When the sentence was read, 15 years with the possibility of parole after 7, I felt no relief, only a kind of numb symmetry. 15 years, the same number of years since Ethel's death, as if the universe insisted on balancing its books. As they led him away, he turned once more, not to seek forgiveness, but to confirm my witness, and I nodded, because denial would have been pointless. That nod, small and unrecorded, was the closest thing to truth we would ever share again. Outside the courthouse, the reporters surged forward like a tide. Microphones glinted, cameras blinked, questions darted through the heat. "Mr. Manley, do you feel justice was served? Do you still love your grandson? Will you forgive him?" The last question struck me hardest, because it presumed forgiveness as a resource one could dispense at will, like spare change. I didn't answer. Instead, I pushed through the crowd, each step feeling both heavy and hollow. In the parking lot, beneath the thin shade of a sycamore, I stopped and finally let the tears come, slow and private, the kind that scald more than they cleanse. When I returned home, the house greeted me with its familiar quiet, that companionable stillness that has followed me since Ethel left it. On the kitchen table lay the newspaper someone had kindly or cruelly delivered while I was gone. The front page bore Justin's mugshot beside my old faculty portrait, a visual equation of guilt by resemblance. The headline read, "A legacy of chemistry ends in chains." I folded it carefully and set it in the trash, understanding the stories once told no longer belong to the people who lived them. That evening I received a call from the detective one final time. "It's over, Mr. Manley," he said. "The lab's dismantled, the charges dropped, your name cleared. Officially." The word "officially" lingered, fragile as glass. "Thank you," I said, though gratitude seemed a poor currency for what I'd endured. He hesitated. "For what it's worth, you handled it with dignity." Dignity, another word people use when they mean helplessness performed gracefully. After the call, I walked through the house, switching off lights one by one, leaving each room darker than the last. When I reached the basement door, I hesitated. It had remained shut since the cleanup, sealed like a scar. I opened it and descended slowly, the air cool and faintly chemical, even after all these months. The shelves were bare now, the floor spotless, but I could still see the ghosts of what had been. Faint outlines on the concrete, shadows where equipment once stood. I stood in the center of the room and tried to imagine Justin down here, bent over the bench, convinced he was building a future. I wanted to hate him for it, but the hatred refused to come. What rose instead was a terrible tenderness, the kind that precedes surrender. I realized, with a clarity that felt almost holy, that forgiveness was not something I could give him. It was something I owed myself, if I was ever to climb those stairs again. I don't know how long I stood there. Time had become an elastic thing, stretching and recoiling. When I finally emerged, the sun had set, and the house was filled with the smell of lilacs drifting through the open window. I sat at the table with a pen and a blank sheet of paper, intending to write to Justin, but the words resisted order. How do you speak to the architect of your own ruin? In the end, I wrote only a few lines. You are loved. That is still true. Whatever comes next, remember that. I sealed the letter and left it unaddressed. The next morning, I drove to the school where I'd once taught, the first time I'd returned since my retirement. The front gate was new, the paint still bright, but everything else felt smaller, as if memory had inflated it beyond its real dimensions. I walked past the science wing, peered through the glass at the lab benches, and saw my own reflection staring back, a ghost among ghosts. A janitor appeared, startled, and I explained who I was. Recognition softened his face. We heard about your grandson, he said quietly. I'm sorry. I thanked him and turned to leave, but he added, You know, kids still talk about your experiments, the good kind. For the first time in months, I smiled. That night, I took a walk around the block, the air warm and humming with insects. The neighbors nodded, some out of courtesy, others out of a need to erase their earlier suspicion. The birch tree by my porch whispered in the wind, shedding a few pale curls of bark that landed on my shoulder like a benediction. I realized I had survived the story that was meant to bury me. The scandal, the shame, the loneliness, all of it had burned away until only the essential remained. The stubborn pulse of a man who refused to disappear. Back inside, I poured myself a small glass of bourbon, a habit Ethel used to scold. I lifted it toward the ceiling, not as a toast, but as an act of recognition. To her, to Justin, to the quiet mercies that arrive too late, but still arrive. Outside, thunder murmured over the hills, distant and tired. I sat there until the glass was empty, then whispered into the stillness, It's over. But even as I said it, I knew that what had ended was only the noise. The story, like the faint scent of chemicals in the basement, would linger long after I was gone. When I finally went to bed, the window was open, and the night breeze carried the smell of rain. I dreamed, not of the courtroom or the basement or the sirens, but of a classroom filled with light, Ethel standing at the back, smiling, and a young boy laughing as colored flames rose harmlessly from a beaker. In the dream, everything was balanced again, every reaction complete, every equation closed. And for the first time in a long while, I slept without fear. In the months after the trial, the world resumed its indifferent rotation, and I found myself living inside a silence so complete it began to feel structural, like part of the house itself. The television stayed off, The phone rarely rang, and even the birds seemed to have forgotten the tune they used to wake me with. I moved through the rooms like a caretaker of ruins, tidying objects that no longer carried meaning, dusting books I no longer opened. People said I was lucky, the charges gone, the scandal fading. But luck, I discovered, is simply the absence of disaster, not the presence of peace. I had been exonerated by the law, yes, but not by the story that had replaced me in other people's minds. When I passed through town, I could still feel the pause in conversation, the subtle shift of attention, the way pity rearranges a face. So I stopped going to town. I paid bills by mail, bought groceries online, spoke to no one except the delivery driver who left boxes at the porch and wished me a good day without waiting for an answer. Autumn arrived early that year, the trees turning before the air had cooled, and I took it as a sign to start over, though I had no idea what that meant at 74. The house, despite its history, had begun to feel less like a home and more like a museum of misinterpretations. So I put it up for sale. The realtor, a young man with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, said the market was strong, but the stigma might lower the price. I told him to lower it as much as he liked. Money had long ago lost its power to either harm or help me. Within a month, the house sold to a couple from Spokane, who wanted something with character. I wished them luck with the ghosts. On the day I left, I stood in the empty kitchen one last time, touching the spot on the counter where Ethel used to rest her coffee cup, and whispered, "We did our best." Then I locked the door, placed the key in the mailbox, and drove north toward the mountains. The cabin I bought was small, barely more than a box of wood and light wedged between two pines, but it had what I needed: quiet, distance, and a porch that faced west so I could watch the sun dissolve behind the ridge each evening. The first nights there were strange, almost frightening in their stillness. No traffic, no sirens, no voices, only wind and the occasional cry of a coyote echoing across the valley. I realized how much of my old life had been shaped by background noise, how much comfort I had drawn from the mere hum of civilization. Out here, every sound mattered: the groan of the rafters, the crackle of the stove, my own breath turning into mist. Gradually, the silence became less like an absence and more like a companion that demanded honesty. You cannot lie to silence. It remembers the exact tone of your voice. Each morning, I walked the narrow trail that wound through the aspens, carrying a thermos of coffee and the same notebook I'd once used for lesson plans. I began to write, not confessions, not apologies, but recollections arranged like chemical equations, cause and effect, reactant and product. I found that memory, when written without ornament, behaves like an element seeking stability. I wrote about Ethel and her quiet humor, about my students who taught me patience, about Justin before the shadow grew too large. I did not write about the trial or the police or the headlines. Those belonged to another version of me. The pages filled quickly, my handwriting shaky but determined, and one afternoon I realized that the notebook had become something I hadn't planned. A letter addressed not to the boy in prison, but to the man he might become when the sentence ended. When I mailed it, I used the address of the correctional facility and no return label. Inside, I wrote that love is not absolution, but endurance, that the heart's only real chemistry is persistence in the face of corrosion. I told him I would not visit again till he asked me to. I told him I had forgiven him, not because he deserved it, but because carrying anger had become too heavy for one's spine. Then I signed it simply. Grandpa? Weeks passed with no reply, and I stopped expecting one. Yet on the first day of winter, a thin envelope arrived, the return address printed in that familiar angular hand. The letter inside was brief, barely 3 sentences, but it was enough. I got your notebook. I read every word. I'm trying. Don't forget me. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in the drawer beside Ethel's journal. It was the first thing in years that made me believe time could heal instead of only erode. The seasons moved again. Snow gathered against the cabin walls, melted, returned. I learned to live without clocks, measuring days instead by the shape of the light. I cooked simple meals, fixed small things, read aloud to no one. Sometimes, when the wind carried voices from hikers passing far below, I would imagine one of them was Justin, free at last, calling up to tell me he'd made it home. In those moments, I understood that redemption is rarely dramatic. It's the slow, almost invisible act of continuing. One spring morning, while sorting through old papers, I found the photograph that had once been evidence, the image of my basement, the glassware glinting under the police lights. I studied it for a long time, then turned it over and wrote on the back, "Every experiment leaves residue. Clean what you can. Live with what you can't." I tacked it to the wall above my desk as a reminder that mistakes, like elements, cannot be destroyed, only transformed. Now, as I sit on the porch watching the last of the snow retreat into the soil, I realize the story has already ended, though not in the way stories are supposed to. There was no grand reconciliation, no public redemption. Just a man in the mountains, alive and mostly unafraid, waiting for whatever quiet mercy the next season will bring. The past still visits sometimes, soft-footed and uninvited, but I've learned to pour it a cup of coffee and let it sit beside me until it fades with the daylight. And when night falls and the first stars appear above the tree line, I think of Ethel, of the boy who lost himself, of the man who almost did, and I whisper the only prayer I still remember. Let the living learn from the broken, and let the broken find rest. In the hush that follows, the wind moves through the pines like breath, and I know that somewhere beyond the ridge, spring is returning again, indifferent and generous, carrying with it the faintest scent of lilac.